Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack some truly spine chilling, real life accounts sourced directly from a recent deep dive into paranormal encounters in India. And what makes these accounts so deeply unsettling isn't that they're happening in some ancient, creepy, abandoned castle. No, it's that they take place in incredibly mundane, everyday locations. We are talking about shared corporate apartments, standard hotel lobbies, and local vintage shops. Places you and I could walk into right now. So let's decode the anatomy of these encounters, how they escalate, and the genuinely terrifying histories hiding right beneath the surface.
Here is the roadmap for our journey into the unknown today. First, we'll examine the urban horrors of a shared corporate flat in Gurgaon. Then we'll pack up and travel to the isolated, mystical hills of Kasadevi in Uttarakhand to look at some incredibly intense anomalies. And finally, we'll head back to the city to examine a deeply intriguing haunted artifact right in the heart of Delhi.
All right, Act 1. The urban horrors, specifically the cursed corporate flat of Gurgaon. Now, this scenario is hyper-relatable for literally thousands of young professionals. Imagine this. 4 guys working in a massive multinational company, sharing a pricey apartment just to split the rent. Standard stuff, right? But according to the source material, this incredibly mundane setup quickly spiraled into a total psychological nightmare. Now, the way things escalated in this flat was incredibly subtle at first. For a new tenant named Ankush, it started with little things you'd easily just brush off. Like the power would cut out, but a ceiling fan would somehow just keep spinning at top speed, even though the switch was literally flipped to the off position. Make it make sense, right? Then kitchen taps started opening entirely on their own. It's that classic denial phase where everyone just blames a faulty wire or a forgetful roommate. But then, the heavy, rhythmic knocking on the bedroom doors began. And this brings us to a terrifying breaking point for Ankush. He experienced what the source describes as a truly harrowing episode of sleep paralysis. Picture this. He's lying in bed in the freezing Delhi winter, but he's sweating profusely. He can clearly see his roommate sleeping across the room, but he can't speak. He can't move a muscle. Suddenly, he hears this heavy knocking. Thunk, thunk. And then his bedroom door violently flies open. But the very second his body finally snaps out of the paralysis, he realizes the door is firmly shut. Was it just a hallucination? Just a bad nightmare? Well, the sequence of events that followed suggests it was actually a warning. Let's follow how this builds to a truly shocking climax. So, to save a little extra cash, the flatmates rented out a tiny spare study room to a new guy. Step 1, he moves in. Step 2, he rapidly deteriorates. He becomes completely reclusive, develops deep, dark circles under his eyes, stops eating with the group, and just starts looking genuinely terrifying. Step 3 is the eruption. At 2 a.m., he storms out of his room, violently throwing heavy objects and just screaming. And finally, Step 4. According to the accounts, he exhibited such unnatural strength that it actually took 4 grown men to physically tie him down with bed sheets until a doctor could arrive and sedate him with an injection. And the dark twist to all this? The source reveals that a few years prior, a young woman had brutally taken her own life in that exact tiny study room. The landlord had completely hidden this fact just to keep collecting rent. And this kind of urban horror isn't even an isolated incident. The sources briefly point out another famous Gorgon legend, a massive corporate building near the Secandapur metro station, where, allegedly, no night shift can operate after 8 p.m. It remains entirely shut down at night due to heavy paranormal sightings. It really makes you stop and wonder about the histories of the spaces we occupy every single day. But let's leave the city behind for a moment. Act 2 takes us to the isolated, majestic hills of Kasar Devi in Uttarakhand. Up here, the horror completely shifts gears from claustrophobic haunted rooms to shape-shifting entities and massive supernatural forces. The source material details a rapid, terrifying sequence of events experienced by a female hotel trainee who was working the night shift during the 2020 lockdown. On night 1, she sees a woman standing there without a mask. When she goes over to hand her one, the woman steps behind a pillar and just vanishes into thin air. By week 2, a massive heavy housekeeping cart is rolling down the hallway entirely on its own, stopping and flipping over right in front of her feet. By month 1, she confronts a guest smoking in the lobby, only for him to literally float into the air and disappear right through a window. And the absolute climax of her experiences, month 2, where the security cameras capture a woman in a white gown staring directly into the CCTV lens with glowing red eyes right before completely disappearing from the footage. So, the crucial takeaway here is that this wasn't just happening in her head, this wasn't isolated to her.
A new local hire was tasked with collecting room service plates from the notoriously active third floor. He came running downstairs, absolutely screaming for his life, claiming he saw an entity violently smashing the plates. As he looked at it, he said its mouth began opening wider and wider and wider. Needless to say, he quit the very next morning. Now, the area around Qasar Devi is famous for its intense energies, which actually leads the source to an incredibly dark first-hand account of an exorcism. The entity in question here was identified as a Brahma Rakshas. In Hindu mythology, this is a highly powerful, fierce demonic spirit, okay? This is not your run-of-the-mill ghost. It is considered notoriously difficult to control, let alone exorcise. The source details witnessing this exorcism near the temple. And let me tell you, the environmental chaos that ensued was staggering. It's like a movie. First, as the ritual began, a sudden, cinematic, thick fog and high winds just rolled in out of nowhere. Second, when commanded to leave the possessed woman's body, the entity actually spoke back, claiming a white light was blocking its exit and refusing to let it pass. Third, the exorcist was forced to adapt on the fly, spiritually trapping the entity in a nearby tree instead. And finally, when the physical offerings from the ritual were tied up in a bag and thrown off the nearby cliff, the source reports it didn't sound like a bag hitting the dirt. No, it echoed with the deafening boom of a massive bomb blast. Absolutely wild. But here is the most chilling part of this entire Qasar Devi story: the dark motive. Why on earth was this woman possessed by a Brahmarakshas in the first place? Well, the source reveals it was the result of a petty family property dispute. The victim's own relatives had allegedly sent this dark curse to end her bloodline, purely for financial gain. The source notes the woman suffered horrific miscarriages, with her husband witnessing literal, invisible punches manifesting on her stomach. It is a grim, terrifying reminder that sometimes the most horrifying supernatural events are rooted entirely in plain old human greed. All right, for our final act, Act 3, we are heading back to the urban landscape, specifically to a vintage shop in Delhi. We are shifting from haunted places to a haunted, or perhaps cursed, object. According to the source, an avid watch collector bought a very specific vintage timepiece from an old, famous repair shop in Nizamuddin, Delhi. It was a square-dial 1970s watch. The lore attached to it? Well, it originally belonged to a notorious 1970s smuggler. This was a man who dealt in gold and antiques and who was ultimately killed by police in a highly violent shootout inside a disco. The collector, totally fascinated by this gritty history, decided to wear the watch for 24 hours straight. And this is where the story gets incredibly fascinating, because the watch basically brought a dual reality to the collector. On one hand, we have the curse. Every single night, the wearer is plagued by terrifying, recurring nightmares. He finds himself standing in a 1970s disco, wearing the watch, and vividly experiences being gunned down in a chaotic shootout. He is essentially living the original smuggler's brutal death on a loop. But on the other side, we have the blessing. In his waking life, the watch brings him immense, undeniable luck. Since he started wearing it, he miraculously cheated death in a major traffic accident, and every single business deal he brings the watch to is a massive financial success. It's almost like the spirit or the energy attached to the object is paying him for bearing its trauma. Believe it or not, the collector actually still wears the watch to this day for important meetings. He actively chooses to endure the absolute nightmare for the waking success. Which brings us to a final, provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. Based on everything we've decoded today, if a cursed object guaranteed you ultimate, undeniable success in your waking life, but subjected you to terrifying, violent nightmares every single time you closed your eyes, would you wear it? Thanks so much for joining me as we navigated these incredible accounts. Until next time, keep analyzing, keep questioning, and maybe double-check the history of your apartment.